Today I'd like to talk about the full circle of test automation. And the full circle of test automation is a kind of concept I came up with when I was doing several projects in a row dealing with test automation. That's some time ago, but the funny thing is, like in the Netherlands we have the Test Automation Day, which is a conference on test automation. And I spoke there 1 year talking about my project, and the next year I did another project and I told another story, but it was kind of the sequel. The story continued and it represented my journey. And I did that the year after as well. And the fourth year we kind of combined the experiences and told the whole story, looking back and looking forward. And I shared my findings, which I called the full circle. And we'll get to that later in a bit. So I dusted off that full circle, and the question is, how's that standing today, with a special focus on how does maturity play a role in the success of test automation, because that's the start point and the end point of the circle. And I'm helped that with Eric van de Graaf, who actually worked on one of the projects I will be talking about, and recently became a colleague of mine, and Rene Veldhuijzen, who has a lot of knowledge on test automation as well. So I really enjoyed collaborating with them in making this presentation. The focus is on maturity today. So I trust, I hope, and I think the IT has grown in its maturity over the last 10 years, 20 years. We adopted new practices, we learned how to work agile, we speeded up, do new technologies, that kind of stuff. And growing in maturity means that we embrace new practices. And agile being one of them, DevOps being one of them, but continuous integration and deployment is really important. And if you think about quality, built-in quality, they preach you to do test first principles like BDD and TDD. So those practices should be embraced in order to improve our development lifecycle and build quality in. But there's a funny thing, because are those really embraced? I wrote a book which came out this month, in which I stated, like, these are the practices that we should do. And then one of my reviewers called me up and said, like, you can write that, but it's not really a standard practice yet. And in the same week, the state of testing was released. It's an annual report which looks at certain things. And you can indeed see that Agile and DevOps are quite adopted, but TDD and BDD are in their 20% range. So a lot of people are not doing BDD and TDD. So there's some tension. On one side, we preach at conferences, like, do this, it's good, it helps you. While on the other hand, the daily practice seems to be more difficult and it's hard to actually implement them and use that. So I rang up Jill Silberfeld, who is quite an expert in TDD and does workshops on that, and asked him, like, how's that? How do you think is the adoption of TDD? And he said, well, I've never seen an organization adopting TDD. It requires a new way of thinking and working for the programmers, and that's quite hard. And on top of that, he added that as long as we are rushing in and do half the design, build a quarter of the functionality, put some tests on top of that, well, you cannot really call that TDD, because you don't get the benefits from it at all. And I think that happens a lot. We don't do the practices right, or we don't have time to do them right. Because embracing a practice is quite a challenge. And how come that is? I like to explain that using the example of continuous integration and deployment. I always like to show this picture, which shows 8 requisites of continuous integration and deployment. Things that you should have in place in order to make it a success. And if I talk with the engineering people, they say, oh, it's quite easy to do continuous integration and deployment. You just connect some tools and then you got a pipeline running. Well, I can tell you it's not that easy. For me, it's not, because I lack a lot of knowledge. I tried, I couldn't get the tools working, got frustrated. So yes, that's a trick that you need to have some skills for. But it's more than just building the pipeline. I think if you focus on the pipeline, you miss a lot of things. And these requisites enable you to have a discussion about that in the organization and see whether things are in place. And things that you need to have in place is you need to have teams that collaborate, because you want to integrate, so they should be working on the same stuff. You want to go live, but it's good to have an architecture which is not a monolith, but enables you to go live with small pieces. And yes, you need to have the automated test, and you need to have the pipeline, the hands-off deployment circle. But how about acceptance criteria? They should be okay, otherwise you don't know what to test. You should go live, so your organization should be able to launch frequently to production and deal with that. Then you want to have, I think, a feedback loop that you learn things from production, the errors, and insert them again in your acceptance criteria or your automated tests so you avoid them for the next time. And you need to have teams that have enough skills and knowledge and can singly deliver a piece of end-to-end software, a feature that's autonomous, and bring that live and test that. So maybe you need to shift teams, people from teams. That means quite an organization, and you should be willing to do that. So there's more to it than just technique in order to embrace a practice like continuous integration and deployment. And it takes time. So this is an overview that I got from another benchmark report, and it shows how much time developers are spending on several things, on writing code. And I think if you want to implement new practices like CI/CD, like BDD, all the time needed to learn and to do that is coming from that 10-20% time that's left over for other stuff. And a lot of pressure on the team to make that they don't have much time to do that. So what we need to do in order to increase the maturity of the IT department, of the development teams, is to engage the teams to start working on those practices and embrace them, empower them by giving them time, tools, space to do so, and support them as management and explain them that it's really important. And then we can improve our maturity. So let's go to the circle of test automation. The first lesson is about the business case. Well, actually, there's one lesson before. I think when I started with testing, we had a lot of people doing the Millennium tests. We had a lot of non-technical testers that were doing manual tests, and they were quite happy doing that. I think they were some kind of scared of test automation. They didn't really like that. They didn't want to be a programmer. So what we always said, like, you need to have your maturity of your testing in place before you start automating. Otherwise, it won't work. You got shelfware and that kind of stuff. And we were kind of happy with that because a lot of organizations were not really mature yet, and we could delay the implementation of test automation and continue with our manual work, which we liked a lot. So the first circle starts with we're not mature enough, so we cannot really do test automation. Only to find out, especially when Agile came along, that we want to learn how to do automation. We need to learn. It takes some time to learn as well. You cannot, with the knip of your fingers, actually practice test automation. So we need to get started anyway, even if we're not really mature yet. And that gives some problem, because that means that we should think about, do we want to gain experience or do we want to improve the maturity first? And if we gain experience without improving the maturity, we end up with some low maturity test automation. And maybe does Rene have an example for that? Do you have an example, Rene? Rene?
Oh, hi Derk-Jan.
Yeah, do you have an example?
Of immature testing and test automation? Yeah, I have one. Well, I have many. But I once did a course on a test automation tool bought or built by Oracle. And I immediately became an expert, apparently, because I was hired just by doing the course. And when I came there, they had a very expensive licensing tool, but looking at the scripts, they were only good paths. You know, input something, expect something, it's okay. No exceptions, no errors, no validations. And we had about a half year's work on enhancing the scripts before we could finally use them within the test automation tool. So half years of money thrown away, right? And that's why it's always important to first look at the quality of your test scripts before you start using them in test automation. Because as Dorothy Graham once said, if you automate crap, you get very fast crap. Well, she said it in nicer terms, of course, but you understand what I'm getting at.
So we need to think about the maturity and think about the business case. An interesting question is, like, what are you paying for? I had some projects where I needed to convince management by making a business case, what it cost and what it would benefit from. But since the organization was not mature, we added extra stuff like writing scripts, choosing the tools, doing the tool selection, thinking about the infrastructure. So the amount in the business case became quite a big amount, but actually we were compensating for other stuff that were not really in place. So I made a checklist where I made that more explicit and said there are 5 levels. You need to think about the needs and the benefits. Why do you want to automate and where do you want to automate? You should define which system you want, which kind of tests or risks you want to cover. Then you have the tools and the infrastructure. You need to embed it in the process, the development process and the test process. That's probably changing. And you need to have the organization in place. Maybe train people, get the roles clear and that kind of stuff. And if those are not in place, you're paying for a lot of money in your business case for things that might have been needed in the first place for manual testing as well. But then if you have a business case, you might convince, we did, organizations to start with test automation as well. The second part of the full circle is about lowering the thresholds and getting teams actually to start with test automation. And this falls together with a new project that I did where management actually said, we want to have that test automation in place. We want to encourage the teams to start with test automation. We need to do that. And then some people said like, well, if we want to do that, we need to encourage the teams to start with that. We should lower the threshold to start with them and we should support them. And funny enough, Eric was one of the guys that was involved in that and he explains what we're doing.
Hello everyone. So Derk-Jan, you asked me a question about my take at least on what's changed in the last couple of years in terms of supporting roles for test automation. And to answer that question, I need to take you back to the year 2013, where I was supporting a member of a test automation team at a customer, and they were working in the waterfall time period. Later on, they transitioned to Agile, was also very interesting, but I will focus on the supporting role in that waterfall era. And what we did was supply those test automation services to various projects, but not all of the projects that were convinced of the test automation. But we had a plan and approach to also show them and prove to them that test automation was indeed, could at least be effective for them.
So in that time, we really need to convince people to get started. And that aligns maybe with the functional testers that I was explaining earlier. So we made a concept, an approach, which was quite simple. And the gray box is the core of that. And Eric was involved in that, where we went to the teams and the projects and did a proof of concept. We took some tests of them and showed them how that was working. So in a week, maybe 2 weeks in throughput time, we could show them that it worked. So there was a technical feasibility and we were looking at the skills so we could tell something about the organizational feasibility, how it worked in the processes and they had the people available. Part of my job was to go sit with the project managers and the department heads and make a business case, so we even had an economical feasibility. And at the end of the pilot we had, and I think that's quite funny for that time, we had a formal approach where we had the management commitment to start with test automation. Then we expected the teams to be self-supporting and improve their testing, make their test set more big, add some extra tests, and that's the triangles showing that we got more scripts when the time grows. And we even had some support because we think maybe they have some questions, and we got Eric's team that can help with some questions about that. Here's a box which is not mentioned yet. That's our exploration phase where we were thinking like which projects do we want to involve, what tools do we want to support, and we used some kind of heat map of that. And I really like that because we had the different departments and the different technologies and all the systems in there, and we did an analysis and we thought there are some solutions that we already have in place that we know how to use the tools, and now we can test web, for instance. So the low-hanging fruit would be to use that knowledge and go to the teams that have systems in the same technology, so we can use the knowledge that we have, apply the tools that we already are familiar with, and make an easy start. Knowing that there were also some mainframes computers where we didn't really know how to do the automation, so we thought let's postpone that and let's celebrate our success first. And then we went into the teams and said, like, let's do a proof of concept, just give us some tests that we're going to automate And they were thinking sometimes like, yeah, but what tests do we want to give you? And we had a discussion about that. And said like maybe you should give the test that you run most often, your 10% most critical tests, for instance. But what are your most critical tests? Maybe Rene has some idea on that.
Oh, you've gotten to the 10% most critical already. Well, how do you decide on what is the 10% most critical? Does it have to be even 10% or 8 or 12? I don't care. I mentioned earlier on, your maturity has to be up there, right? You know, otherwise you get very fast crap. And I talked about regression testing, which is a very easy way in because you already have test cases which you can automate. And then there's the company critical application, but you don't want to fail on that one, so I would steer away from that. Maybe looking at the most often used application, because everyone knows that one, everyone likes that one. It's a very easy way to convince your company to use test automation. But it helps you also in finding out how the test automation works, if your scripts are up to the level that you need them to be, and if your knowledge and experience is already good enough to go on with the other 90%, right? So take the easy way in. Stick to the things you know, the things other people like, the things that the business can relate to. Then you can make the big step on using test automation, going to CI/CD, automated pipelines, stuff like that.
Okay. So one thing that we saw when we went into the teams is that automation drove the improvements, because teams said like, oh, we're going to write some tests down that we didn't do. We're going to do some prioritization. We're going to make that smoke test set. We're going to define those 10%. But I think if we compare it to nowadays, that can be true, but it's not only that the test automation drives improvements. I think development drives improvements, because teams are more quality.
And also what you see in teams now, it's also very interesting, is that the developers are more and more infected with the software quality mindset. So really also participate in setting up a test automation. For example, creating framework functions, and they give that to the tester or the test automator, and they can make use of that and enhance that further.
So the teams are responsible for the quality, not just the testers. And I think that's something that we say as a need that's happening in some organizations. But I have to say I see some organizations that have silo testers that are in the offshore team and are disconnected from the development team. But it's a good thing to go for, I think. But what we did in the full circle back then was that we did the pilot, got people working on that, and when they we needed to give them some support, and we needed to embed the test automation in the organization. And that's the third part of the full circle. And we already anticipated support. There was that small box that we had in the corner. And we didn't really give that much thought, but suddenly when people came up to speed, we got more questions and we needed to think about what the support was. And that grew, and we were thinking about buying licenses, sharing licenses, giving support for tools, offering new tools, examining new tools that might be a good solution for the future, all that kind of stuff. But then something happened.
And along came Agile, and then we had a big transition. So I will skip ahead to 2021, where we're also in like similar circumstances where we have the need for test automation.
Yeah, so everything changed.
But as you maybe know, that old waterfall way of working where you had a single test automation team servicing projects is not there anymore. So agile teams need to make sure they can automate the things. So that supporting role is now different. And then I'll answer the question.
So the supporting role is changing. How is that
So
working?
what's the difference? So I think there are now still some supporting teams, but they are only supporting like components. It could be an infrastructure component, for example, a virtual workplace where you can set up the test automation, or some generic libraries you can make use of. But very domain specific or team specific test automation implementation, the team has to do themselves. So they need to be knowledgeable about test automation.
And that's interesting because teams need to know their testing and increase the maturity of that. And I'm thinking about writing the scripts, knowing which tests to execute. They should be disciplined in order to improve and invest in the practices. And they should have knowledge on how to work with the tests, work with the tools, how to implement that, especially when there are more technical small things and challenges, but also knowledge about which tool to select. And we were struggling with that in our project because we didn't want to superimpose the tools, because we wanted to empower the teams to pick their own tool and use something which they benefited most because it's their way of creating value. But we didn't want to have a wild growth of tools either. So we came up with a concept which we called the fruit bowl. And some people liked it and some managers hated it, but it was an analogy of what we were doing. So some discussion picture where we said, like, we got apples. The green apples are solutions that we're familiar with, and we encourage teams to use that. We make that low threshold. We offer that proof of concept. We offer support. So people pick the green fruit. And we know there are some red fruit, for instance, the solution for the mainframes that we might need to develop, but we don't have that knowledge yet, but that we will investigate that. And then we got some other fruit that teams may come up with, and we need to investigate that and maybe find a way to offer that to the other teams as well. Nowadays, you don't have to buy a lot of expensive tools because a lot of things is open source.
What you also see is more and more open source influences. And I think open source is very successful for many companies these days because there's really no threshold in terms of licensing to take that open source on board and start working with it. So you can make use of that open source software and adopt it. And developers like that way of working. They just want to pick up that open source project and play around with it, see if it's successful. And if it has success, it will spread like a cloud. It will spread over multiple teams, and they start adopting it. That's one of the successes of open source, in my opinion.
So we lay a lot of responsibility with the teams. We allow them to use their own tools, which are freely available. They can download and experiment that. And we wanted to spread it like a cloud, like Eric is saying. So we need to do a lot of knowledge sharing. And where we had the expertise center as the sole body of knowledge on the test automation, now that's distributed over the teams. And we need to find ways to do that. And I think in modern organizations, we have chapters, guilds, community of practices. But you all have been probably at a guild meeting where half of the people showed up because the rest was too busy. So in order to keep that live and stimulating, we need to engage people, we need to empower them, and we need to support them and explain them that it's really important and the freedom, time for it in order to exchange that information. So how's that for you as expertise center? What was your role?
And my role was really like leading that test automation team, making sure the right things were done. And looking at new possibilities for automation, new projects to involve in the test automation. But all the knowledge of the test automation was within that team.
Mm-hmm. And now that's distributed over the teams. So the role of Eric might dissolve in something like a chapter lead or a practice lead, which has the task to stimulate that knowledge exchange, reduce the growth of tools, try to do cross-team exchange of information, but not restricting the team, but to encourage them to share their successes so it can be spread, and we end up with an effective set of tests, that tools that are supported by the teams. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Eric?
So Derk-Jan, that's about it. I hope it answered your question, and give it over back to you.
Thank you very much. Bye. So maybe it's time for some reflection, because we made the full circle and we're kind of back to the starting point where we were talking about maturity, because we started talking about maturity is important. We shouldn't start first. We gave some examples of immature projects, and we saw that we had to do a lot of extra work to cover up for things that should have been in place but were just aspects of immature testing. If we need a business case, that means that there's a lot of costs that we make and throughput time that is basically covering up and compensating for things that are not there. But if we get started, we learn that test automation can drive improvements. It did then, but now maybe even development drives improvements. And tools are more accessible, so it's more easy to actually start with it without too big licenses. And the support is no longer a central body of knowledge, but is more reduced and part of the teams. But we need to invest in the people so they have time to exchange information and are willing to learn. And maybe there's some final thoughts from you on the human factor, Rene? Rene? Rene?
Yeah, I know, right?
The human factor.
We keep coming back to the same discussions about getting a success out of test automation, speeding things up. And that's silly, right? Because if you look at it, all the tools we use are getting smarter, getting faster, getting easier to use. Why can't we speed things up? Well, life around us is speeding up. Everything gets faster. Software lifecycle development goes faster, with all the agile going on. And that's not a bad thing, but we're forgetting one main important thing, the human equation. Because, well, you can automate, but you still need the humans to do the input and look at it and accept what we are doing, right? And that's one of the main reasons why it still takes a lot of effort, because not only the implementation of test automation requires a lot, we talked about the maturity, selecting the right processes and applications, doing the pilot, but then you get into the acceptation phase, how do we use it? When do we use it? Now that's a very important thing to look at, but I will get back to you on that in a moment.
Well, please do, Rene. Give us your thoughts.
That's interesting. Simon Sinek wrote a book, Start with Why. And that's what you need to start with when asking yourself if you should use test automation. And if you have set clear, realistic goals, then you can fill in the blanks on the what do we want to automate. Regression testing, performance testing, CI/CD pipelines, monitoring, defect management, BDD, TDD, ATDD, any abbreviation you want to use. And when you have filled in the blanks, then you can focus on how do we want to automate, which tools will we use, how do we implement it, what colleagues will use it, stuff like that. And if you have used this way, start with why, then the what, then the how, then you have paved the way for successful test automation. Good luck.
So those are nice words, and I think it's a good point. And how about that key question about maturity? I think we made a full circle and we learned that maturity is important. But are we back to square one? I think we learned an important lesson over the years, because we no longer focus on writing just that single script and automate the tests. We're much more quality focused and trying to improve the maturity of the software development lifecycle, of the output, the value delivery. And the responsibility has become not just the testers, but more a team responsibility, where we still talk about maturity, but in a much wider sense. And on the checklist, I already stated you need to know the why. And yes, we're still thinking about that. So before we rush in, think about what you want to reach as a goal and what you need to have in place, and take those practices and apply them in order to have a better maturity and a smooth flow. And I wish you good luck with that, on behalf of Eric and Rene as well. Good luck with your test automation.